The first time someone tried to break into my cabin, I had been divorced for less than 9 hours. Rain slammed the roof so hard it sounded like fists. The old front door shook in its frame. A shadow moved across the fogged glass. Then the knob twisted once, twice, hard enough to make the rusted lock scream. I froze in the middle of the kitchen with a flashlight in one hand and a cast iron skillet in the other. My whole body numb from the mountain cold and from the sound that came next my phone buzzing across the table, with a new voice message from my ex-husband. I don't know why I played it. Maybe I wanted proof that my life really had broken that fast. Maybe pain had become a habit. Grant's laugh filled the dark cabin, sharp and smug and cruel. How's the wilderness, Mara? You trade a real life for a dead woman's shack and run off before midnight. You always did love drama. Then he laughed again, like the end of our marriage was the funniest thing he had ever seen. Outside, the person at my door stopped twisting the knob and dragged something metal across the wood. Slow, deliberate. And that was when I realized this place had not been sitting empty. Someone expected me to leave. I backed toward the fireplace, breast shaking, and whispered to the dark, I'm not going anywhere. I don't know if I said it to the stranger outside, to Grant, or to myself. But that wasn't the worst part. An hour earlier, I had still been in the courthouse parking lot with mascara on my cheeks and 23 years of my life packed into the back of my car. Grant stood beside a silver truck wearing the same navy suit he had worn when he proposed to me. He had one hand in his pocket and one arm around the waist of the woman he said was just a colleague 6 months before I found messages on his phone. Her name was Felicia, and she smiled at me like she had won something expensive. The judge had given Grant the house because his name had been on the mortgage before our marriage. He kept the office too because technically the real estate business had been his venture, even though I had balanced the books, answered the calls, planned the open houses, and swallowed every lonely dinner for 11 years while he built his charm into money. What I got was an old property in Blackthorn Ridge. From my late Aunt Irene, a woman I had only met twice, plus a tiny settlement that wouldn't last 3 months. When the paperwork was over, Grant looked at the deed in my hand and actually laughed. Enjoy the kingdom, he said. 40 acres of trees, a falling down cabin, and God knows what kind of snakes. That's what all your pride bought you. Felicia leaned into him. Maybe she can marry a raccoon. They laughed together while I loaded my car. They laughed while my whole chest burned with humiliation so hot it felt like fever. They laughed because they thought I had lost, and maybe for a few hours I believed them. I left the city before sunset because there was nowhere else to go. My mother had died when I was 20. My father had been gone long before that. I didn't have brothers or sisters. The few friends I had once trusted had slowly drifted away during my marriage, not because they stopped caring, but because Grant had a gift for making me cancel plans, apologize for things I hadn't done, and feel guilty for wanting anyone besides him. He never had to shout to control a room. He did it with little smiles, little sighs, little lines like, if you really loved me, you'd understand. That was the trick of loving a man like Grant. By the time you realized how lonely you were already defending him to everyone else. I had met him when I was 23 and still thought confidence meant safety. He was handsome, polished, good with names, good with hands, good at making a woman feel chosen. For a while, I believed I had finally found a life that would stay still. And the small corrections began. My laugh was too loud. My dresses were too bright. My friend Tessa was a bad influence. My dreams of going back to school could wait. Then came the worst years. The quiet punishments, the cold silences, the way he could turn every hurt into my fault. The deepest crack came after I lost our baby at 16 weeks. I still can't say those words without feeling something tear inside me. I had bled in a hospital room while Grant stood by the window answering emails. Later, when I told him I felt like I was falling apart, he said, "You need to stop living in tragedy. It's not attractive." After that, something in me began dying slowly and stubbornly refusing to stay dead. I didn't know it then, but that small surviving piece was the part of me that would one day save the rest. And then everything changed. Blackthorn Ridge was 4 hours from the city, deeper into the mountains than I had ever driven alone. The roads narrowed until they looked like cracks in the earth. Pines crowded both sides. Fog moved low over the ditches like smoke. My aunt's property sat at the end of a gravel road with no streetlights, no nearby stores, and no neighbors. I could see from the front porch. The cabin was older than anything I had ever lived, in cedar walls silvered by time, sagging steps. one broken porch rail, and a windmill on the hill behind it that turned with a slow, tired groan. Aunt Irene had left a single note taped inside the front window. I found it with my flashlight after I got there. Mara, if you are reading this, then life has been unkind again. Stay 3 nights before you decide anything. Some truths can only be seen after dark. Irene. I remember staring at those words while the air inside the cabin smelled like dust, pine sap, and old smoke. 3 nights before I decide anything? At the time, I thought it was a dramatic old woman's request. I had no idea it was a warning. The power was out when I arrived, so I unpacked my flashlight. Blankets. 2 changes of clothes. A coffee tin full of cash. My mother's photo. The deed. A bottle of water. My phone charger, which did me no good because there was barely enough signal to send one text. I had just stacked my boxes by the fireplace when the rain came. 10 minutes later, someone tried to get in. The sound at the door stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I waited so long my legs cramped. At last, I forced myself to move to the window and lift one corner of the curtain. A truck was turning around at the edge of the driveway with its headlights off. I could only see the shape of it sliding through rain and mud before it disappeared into the dark. I hardly slept. Every creak of the cabin sounded like another hand on the wall. At dawn, I stepped onto the porch and found fresh tire tracks, cigarette ash, and a deep scratch carved into the door. Not random. Not animal, a message. I was kneeling to touch it when a voice behind me said, "You Irene's girl?" I jerked so hard I almost fell off the porch. An old woman stood by the gate in a yellow raincoat, holding a basket under one arm like she had appeared out of the mountain itself. She had a lined face, sharp gray eyes, and the kind of posture that said age had not won the fight. I hadn't heard a car. "I'm Mara," I said. "Who are you?" "Nell Voss." She looked at the scratch on my door, then at me. So they started early. My mouth went dry. Who? Instead of answering, she walked up the steps, set the basket in my hands, and said, "Eggs, biscuits, canned peaches. You'll need food more than fear." Then she looked over her shoulder at the woods. "And listen carefully. If anybody offers to buy this place before Sunday, tell them no." My pulse started climbing again. Why? Because people only rush when they think you're easier to fool than time is. She met my eyes. "And your husband called here 2 weeks ago asking questions. That's reason enough." The cold that ran to me then had nothing to do with weather. I had not told Grant when I was coming. I had barely spoken to him after the divorce papers were filed. But he had already called this mountain. He'd already gone ahead of me. I didn't know what was coming next. Nell came inside and moved around my aunt's cabin like it was half hers. She lit the propane stove, found coffee, and told me stories in pieces while I warmed my hands around a chipped mug. Aunt Irene, she said, had lived there alone for 27 years. She had been stubborn, private, and smarter than most men in the county. She had died 8 weeks earlier after slipping near the North Ravine. Officially, it was an accident. Nell said the word officially like it tasted rotten. "Were you close?" I asked. "As close as Irene let anybody get." Nell sat down across from me. She wasn't expecting to die. She was expecting trouble. I looked at her. "From who?" Nell's jaw tightened. "You'll hear the name soon enough. Right, better you hear it with your eyes open." Right then, a pickup rolled up the driveway. Clean black paint. Expensive tires. City truck and country dirt. A man in a tan jacket stepped out carrying a folder and a smile so polished it made me instantly wary. He was maybe 50, broad-shouldered, expensive watch. Hair too dark to be honest. He climbed the porch like he belonged there. "Ms. Hale?" he called. "Name's Victor Dane. Sorry to intrude. Heard Irene's niece had arrived and thought I'd stop by as a courtesy." Nell muttered. "Vultures don't waste time." Victor ignored her and opened the folder. "I represent Ridgeline Development. We've been interested in this property for years. I know moving out here must be overwhelming, especially under difficult personal circumstances." He said those last words with a sympathetic tilt that made me want to slam the door in his hand. "So I came prepared to make your transition easier. Cash purchase. Fast close, no inspections, no hassle." He slid the paper toward me. The amount made my eyes widen for half a second. It was more money than I had expected to see in months. Maybe a year. Enough to rent an apartment, breathe again, start over somewhere warm and bright, and nowhere near a scratched cabin door. Nell snatched the paper before I could touch it. She said no. Victor smiled at me, not her. "You may want to think for yourself, Ms. Hale. I do, I said more sharply than I felt, and I'm not selling today. His smile thinned. This offer won't stand forever. Then it can leave now. For 1 second, something cold and annoyed flashed across his face. Then the pleasant expression came back. Take your time. But some pieces of land cost more to keep than they're worth. He tipped an imaginary hat and went back to his truck. I watched him drive away with my heartbeat drumming behind my ribs. Nell didn't speak until the truck vanished beyond the trees. That man has been circling this ridge for years, she said. And if he's here day one, your ex-husband told him you were weak. Weak. The word landed like a slap because it was the one I feared most. It was also the one I had spent too long letting other people define for me. But that wasn't the worst part. After Nell left, I started cleaning because it gave my hands something to do besides shake. Under the sink, I found old mason jars. In the pantry, I found dried herbs tied with string. In the bedroom closet, I found my aunt's coat still hanging like she had just stepped out of them. The cabin felt paused, not abandoned. Every drawer held some tiny sign of a woman who meant to come back. In the second bedroom, behind a stack of quilts, I found a narrow locked cabinet built into the wall. There was no key in sight, but somebody had recently tried prying it open. The wood around the latch was split and one screw lay on the floor. A chill walked across my shoulders. Whoever had come to my door last night might not have been trying to scare me out. They might have been trying to get something. I searched until afternoon and finally found a key taped beneath the underside of Aunt Irene's writing desk. My fingers trembled so hard I had to breathe twice before I could fit it in the lock. Inside the cabinet sat a metal box, 3 notebooks, an envelope with my name on it, and a revolver wrapped in oilcloth. For a moment I just stared. Then I opened the letter. Mara, if you have opened this, then I was right to worry. Do not trust quick kindness from strangers. Do not trust your husband if he suddenly shows interest in this land. And before you sign anything, read the black notebook from the beginning. You were left more than a cabin. You were left a reason. My eyes moved over that last sentence again and again. A reason. I sat on the floorboards with the rain light fading through the window and opened the black notebook. The first pages were dates, maps, and names. Surveys, water tables, notes about county meetings. Then her writing changed harder, more urgent. Victor Dane wants the spring. He thinks I don't know the real value. Grant Hale has been asking questions through third parties. If Mara comes here after a divorce, then he has done exactly what I feared. I felt the room tilt. I had met Aunt Irene only twice in my life. Once at my mother's funeral, where she stood in a dark coat and touched my cheek without speaking. Once 6 years later, when she came to the city and took me to lunch. She asked me too many questions about Grant. Did he open my mail? Did he handle all our finances? Did he discourage visits? At the time, I thought she was meddling. Grant certainly did. He called her that mountain witch and laughed when she sent Christmas cards. After a while, the cards stopped coming. I had assumed she lost interest. Now, sitting on the floor of her cabin, I wondered how many things meant for me had never reached my hands. I turned pages faster. The property held an artesian spring under the North Ridge, pure enough to supply half the valley if managed right. More than that, the spring fed Blackthorn Creek, the water source for 3 nearby communities. Victor Dane's company wanted the land because they were planning a private luxury development farther down the mountain. Without Irene's acreage, they had no legal access road and no control over the spring. They could build elsewhere, but not the resort they wanted, not the way they wanted. They needed this piece. They had needed it badly enough to pressure Irene for years. Then I found the line that made my blood go cold. Grant knows because he saw the county draft and smiled like a man finding gold in another person's pocket. I sat there in dead silence, hearing only the tick of the old wall clock and my own pulse. Grant had laughed in that parking lot because he believed I was walking away with a burden. But he already knew this land was valuable. He had known before the divorce. He had known when he mocked me. He thought I would panic, sell it cheap, and crawl back to him or to one of his buyers. My humiliation had been part of his plan. And then everything changed. By evening, the mountain sky had gone the color of bruises. I lit lamps, checked every lock twice, and placed the revolver on the table even though I had never fired a gun in my life. My phone caught a single bar of signal near the kitchen window, just enough for a text from Grant to come through. You calmed down yet? I could still help you fix your mistake. I stared at those words until my jaw hurt. Then I typed back, what exactly do you know about Aunt Irene's property? The answer came fast. Enough to know you can't handle it alone. That was Grant in one sentence. Not concern, not regret. Control wrapped in rescue color paper. I didn't answer again. The next morning, I drove into town to buy supplies and charge my phone. Blackthorn Ridge was barely a town at all. One diner, one gas station, a feed store, a church with peeling white paint, and a courthouse that looked too small to hold any real justice. Inside the diner, conversation thinned when I walked in. Not hostile, curious. The kind of curiosity that had already heard my name. I took a stool at the counter. A man with rough hands and tired blue eyes placed coffee in front of me before I ordered. He was maybe late 30s. Dark beard, flannel shirt, a scar along one wrist. "You're Irene's niece," he said. I braced myself. Yes. She used to sit right there and argue with the newspaper. He nodded toward the coffee. First cups on the house. I managed a small smile. "Thank you, Ellie Turner." He wiped the counter with a rag. "If your porch still leans left, don't use the top step." I blinked. "How do you know my porch leans left?" He gave a half shrug. "I fixed it 3 times for Irene. It always leaned again." Something in his face made me trust him before I had any reason to. Maybe it was that he looked directly at me, not through me. Maybe it was that he didn't ask about the divorce the way everyone else clearly wanted to. But before I could say more, the bell over the diner door rang and Grant walked in. For 1 second, I truly thought I was imagining him. City shoes. Crisp shirt. That same controlled expression. He had driven 4 hours into the mountains without telling me, and he looked far too comfortable doing it. Every muscle in my body locked. "Mara," he said, like we were meeting for brunch. "There you are." My coffee turned bitter in my mouth. "What are you doing here?" He slid onto the stool beside me, ignoring the fact that I leaned away. "You stopped answering. I got worried. Don't lie to me in public. It's embarrassing." Eli's rag stopped moving. The 2 older men at the end of the counter went quiet. Grant gave them a charming smile, then lowered his voice. "Can we talk outside?" "No." He kept smiling, but I saw the pressure harden around his eyes. "You were upset. I get that. But you don't understand what you inherited." I turned to face him fully. "I understand you lied." He blinked once. "About what?" "You knew this land mattered. You knew before the divorce." For a split second, he froze. Then the softness came back to his face, the practiced one. "Mara, sweetheart, you are exhausted. Some developer probably filled your head with nonsense. That land is a headache, not a blessing. Then why are you here?" His jaw ticked. There it was, the small crack in the mask. "Because whether you like it or not, I still care what happens to you." "Funny, you laughed when I left." The diner went silent enough to hear the kitchen fan. Grant leaned closer and whispered, "Don't do this. Sell the place. Take the money. I can get you a better number than anyone else. Not can help you. Not can protect you. Can get you a better number." I stood up so fast my stool scraped. "You really thought I'd missed that, didn't you?" His voice dropped lower. "Mara, no." My hands were shaking, but my voice finally wasn't. "You don't get to walk into my life anymore and call greed concern." He stood too, face tightening. "You have no idea how ugly this can get." Eli stepped around the counter then, not dramatic, not loud, just present. She said no. Grant looked him over within disgust. "Who are you supposed to be? Someone standing closer than you are." The whole room held its breath. Grant let out a humorless laugh, smoothed the front of his shirt, and looked back at me. "You want to make this hard? Fine. But don't call me when you realize pride can't keep the lights on." He walked out without looking back. 10 seconds later, I heard his car peel out onto the road. I sat back down only when my knees nearly gave out. Ely set a glass of water in front of me. "He always liked that." "No," I said, then corrected myself. "Yes, I just didn't always call it that." Eli nodded once, like he understood more than I said. "You might want to check your tires before you drive home." A cold wire of fear slid through me. I ran outside. My rear passenger tire had a clean, hissing puncture near the side wall. Not a nail, not a random tear. Clean, intentional. What I saw next shocked me more than I was ready to admit. Not the slash itself, but the clarity it brought. Grant hadn't come to persuade me. He had come to measure how hard I would be to break. And I think he left with his answer. Ely drove me back to the cabin because the feed store had to order a replacement tire from the next county. The ride should have been awkward, but silence around him felt gentle, not heavy. He kept both hands on the wheel and only asked questions that mattered. Did I have heat? Food? Working locks? A shotgun shell trap on the lower gate? I thought he was joking about that last one. He wasn't. Why would my aunt stay here if it was this bad? I asked as the road climbed. Because Irene didn't scare easy, he said, and because some things are worth being stubborn over. When we reached the cabin, he walked the perimeter without being asked. At the north edge of the property, near a stand of hemlocks, he stopped and crouched. I joined him and saw a fresh boot print in the mud beside the fence line. Too large to be mine. Not old. Somebody's been circling, he said quietly. I swallowed. Victor Dane? Maybe. Maybe somebody he pays. He straightened. I can fix your porch and reinforce the back door if you want. My pride almost answered first. Years of marriage had taught me that accepting help always came with a hidden debt. But then I looked at the print in the mud and remembered my door shuddering under a stranger's hand. Yes, I said. Please. That afternoon, while Eli repaired the back hinge, I kept reading Irene's notebooks. They were full of dates, letters copied by hand, and names of county officials who kept changing positions right after closed-door meetings. She had been building a case. One entry mentioned water testing near the lower ridge. Another said, they are dumping somewhere they shouldn't. If the spring is poisoned, Blackthorn loses more than land. I found a map folded into the back cover with an X marked near the old windmill. I waited until Eli finished and the light turned gold, then took a shovel and followed the trail uphill. The grass around the windmill was high and wet to the knees. At first, I thought the X was wrong. Then my shovel struck metal. Buried under 6 inches of dirt was a locked blue cash box. I carried it back down with my heart pounding so hard my fingers felt clumsy. Eli pried the hinge with a screwdriver while I watched. Inside were water test reports, a flash drive, copies of county proposals, and a sealed envelope labeled 4MRA if they force your hand. I opened that one first. Mara, if you were reading this, then they pushed harder than I could hold. Your husband is not merely cruel. He is involved. Victor Dane's resort plan depends on your land, but the real money is not the cabins. It is the spring. Grant approached me last year pretending concern for your marriage. He wanted me to sign early options. When I refused, he smiled. A smiling man can still be a threat. Trust records, not tears. I had to sit down. Eli looked at me. You okay? No. I laughed once, but it came out broken. And yes, I don't know. I handed him the page. He read silently, jaw tightening. Do you want the sheriff? He asked. I almost said yes. Then I remembered Nell's face when she said, officially. I remembered Victor speaking like the land was already halfway his. I remembered Grant threatening me in a diner full of witnesses because he thought no one here mattered. I want proof first, I said. Eli nodded. Then we get proof. But that wasn't the worst part. That night, with the flash drive plugged into Aunt Irene's old laptop, we found meeting records, survey photos, and scanned copies of letters from Ridgeline Development. Most were the kind of corporate language designed to sound harmless while hiding claws. But one folder, buried under 3 others, held something different: screenshots of text messages between Victor Dane and a number Aunt Irene had labeled G. Get the niece to sell before county review. She has no backbone without him. I stared at the screen so long my eyes watered. Another message: if she gets difficult, remind Grant what happens if environmental reports surface. My voice came out barely above a whisper. Environmental reports? Eli clicked back into the folders until we found them. Soil tests from land adjoining the planned resort road. Chemical traces. Illegal dumping near a runoff line that fed Blackthorn Creek. Someone had been burying construction waste in solvent drums on adjacent parcels for years. If the state found out before permits cleared, the entire development could collapse. Grant wasn't just after money. He was tracked in something dirty enough to ruin him. That was why he came so fast. That was why he punctured my tire. That was why he looked less like an ex-husband and more like a man guarding a secret. A branch snapped outside. We both went still. The porch boards creaked. Once. Twice. Eli killed the lamb. We waited in darkness, listening. Then a bottle smashed against the front of the cabin, followed by the cough of flames. For half a second, my mind refused to understand what I was seeing. The orange bloom racing across the porch rail, the kerosene stink, the heat pushing through the front window. Eli was already moving. He grabbed the fire blanket from beside the stove, shouted for me to get water, and kicked the front door open before I could scream not to. I ran to the sink, filled buckets, sloshed half of each on the way back. By the time I reached the porch, Eli had knocked most of the fire down, but bootsteps were crashing away into the trees. I caught only a shape between trunks. Tall, hooded, fast. We saved the cabin. Barely. My whole body shook afterward. Not from the cold, but from the fact that somebody had just tried to burn me out on my second night there. Eli called Nell first, not the sheriff. 10 minutes later, the old woman arrived with 2 men from town and 1 shotgun between them. Only after they had checked the tree line did someone call law enforcement. Sheriff Bledsoe showed up an hour later, looked at the blackened porch, took 1 slow note and said, "Could have been teenagers." I just stared at him. Teenagers threw fuel on my house in the middle of the night after my tire was slashed and strangers tried my door? He gave a lazy shrug. Mountain kids get bored. Nell stepped closer. Plenty. They usually get bored on Victor Dane's side of the ridge. The sheriff's face hardened. You making accusations now? I'm making observations. Been doing it longer than you've worn that badge. He warns me to be careful and the tone people use when they mean be quiet. Then drove off without collecting the broken bottle. When his taillights vanished, the fear inside me changed shape. It didn't leave. It sharpened. I realized then that if I left, they would win quickly. If I stayed, they might come harder. Somewhere in the middle of that ugly truth, I made my choice. I'm not selling, I said. Nell looked at me over the porch ash and gave 1 short nod. Good, because now we know you matter. And then everything changed. The next 3 days moved like a storm building in circles. Eli installed deadbolts, reinforced windows, and taught me how to fire my aunt's revolver at old cans behind the barn. Nell brought food and local names who could be trusted, who had taken Ridgeline money, who kept their mouths shut because jobs were thin and fear paid regular. I read every page Irene had left me until I could almost hear her voice in the margins. Then I found the entry that cracked the whole thing open. March 12th. Met with attorney Haskell in town. He advised I transfer all documentation to Mara if anything happens to me. He also let slip that Grant had already asked whether the divorce would make her desperate enough to sell. Men are careless when they think old women are furniture. I read that line 3 times. Grant had discussed my desperation before the divorce was even final, not hoped for it. Planned around it. I drove straight to town and marched into the office of Leonard Haskell, Irene's attorney. He was a tidy man with silver hair, spotless glasses, and the uneasy politeness of someone who preferred documents to grief. The moment I placed Irene's notebook on his desk, color left his face. She wrote about meeting you, I said. He folded his hands. Your aunt was concerned. About my marriage? About a number of things. Did Grant come here? He hesitated. That was all the answer I needed. When? I asked. Several months ago. Why? He said he wanted to understand the estate because he feared you were emotionally unstable and could be manipulated. The room went silent. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly Grant. He had come ahead of me, wrapped himself in concern, and used my pain like a key. Even now, my skin burned with the shame of how many times I had let him define me to other people before I entered the room. What did you tell him? I asked. That the property had passed directly to you and that no sale could proceed without your signature. Haskell removed his glasses. I also told him there was a conservation review pending. My breath caught. Conservation review? He opened a file drawer and handed me a folder Irene had not mentioned. Inside was an application to have the North Spring and Memorial Grove designated protected historic land. If approved, Ridgeline's access route would be blocked for years, maybe permanently. Irene had been fighting not just for her cabin, but to keep the whole ridge from becoming private luxury land. And then I saw the condition. Applicant deceased. Review suspended pending heir affirmation. It needed my signature. I looked up slowly. Why wasn't I told this? Haskell's expression darkened. I sent letters. How many? 3. I felt the blood drain from my face. Brad handled most of our mail. He sorted it, stacked it, discarded what he called junk. I had argued about it once. He kissed my forehead and said, "Babe, I'm just helping." Suddenly, all the missing Christmas cards, all the vanished notices, all the little lost pieces of my life rearranged themselves into a pattern that made me sick. He had intercepted my aunt's letters. He had kept me away from the one person who saw him clearly. What I saw next shocked me even more. Haskell slid out a final envelope, unopened and yellowed at the edges. "This one was returned after your husband signed that you had moved," he said. The return date was almost a year old. My fingers went numb as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter from Irene. Mara, I know you are not answering because you are not receiving what I send. If this reaches you late, remember this. Isolation is the first fence cruel men build. When you finally step out of it, do not step back in because it is familiar. I had to put the letter down because I couldn't see through the tears. I walked out of Haskell's office with the conservation forms, the returned envelope, and a kind of grief I didn't have words for. Not just grief for Irene. Grief for the woman I had been while living inside someone else's story about me. But that wasn't the worst part. When I got back to the cabin, Eli was waiting on the porch with blood on his sleeve. I ran to him. What happened? Nothing that needs stitches, he said, which told me it probably had. His truck window had been smashed at the diner parking lot. Someone had left a note under the wiper. Help her again and loose Martange. The Sikala Van's grass. The fear that hit me then was different from the fear for myself. It carried guilt, heat, rage. This is my fault. Eli looked at me steadily. No, this is their choice. They're coming after anyone near me. They're coming after what you own. You just happen to be the woman who stopped kneeling. Something about that line lodged in my chest. Maybe because it was the first time in years anyone had looked at my fear and still spoken to my strength. We signed the conservation affirmation the next morning and sent it by certified courier out of county. Haskell warned us that once Ridgeline realized the review was active again, pressure would spike. He was right. By sunset, Victor Dane was in my driveway with Grant beside him. Seeing them together erased the last polite lie either one had tried to maintain. Victor stayed near the truck while Grant came to the porch alone, empty-handed, wearing the expression of a man who still believed private conversations were his kingdom. I stepped outside before he could ask. You're trespassing, I said. He glanced at the repaired rail, the new locks, the motion light Eli had installed. You've been busy. So have you. He gave a tired sigh. Marat, I am begging you not to make decisions you don't understand. You mean signing the conservation review? His eyes changed. There was no point pretending after that. You had no right. I laughed once, sharp as broken glass. My right is literally on the deed. You're ruining millions in development. You mean your millions. His voice dropped. Ours, if you had any sense. That word hit me like old poison. Sense? The word he used whenever he wanted obedience dressed up as intelligence. I took one step closer. You stood in a courthouse parking lot with your mistress and laughed while I packed my life into a car. And now you're here talking about ours? His face flashed with anger. Felicia is not relevant. She became relevant the minute you moved her into my life before I was out of it. Grant looked over his shoulder toward Victor, then back at me. Listen carefully. Victor can bury you in legal bills. The county can declare that cabin unsafe. The bank can ask questions about Irene's taxes. This place will bleed you dry. And what will you do? Slash more tires? Burn more porches? For the first time, he didn't answer right away. That silence was answer enough. You really did think I'd be too scared to stay, I said softly. His expression hardened into something I had only glimpsed a few times in our marriage, usually when I failed to perform the version of myself he preferred. You were easier when you were sad. The words landed so cleanly they almost didn't hurt at first. Then they did. But what came after was not the old collapse. It was anger cold. Rising, clarifying, get off my property. Grant stared at me for a long second, maybe waiting for me to soften, apologize, fold. When I didn't, he leaned in and said quietly, you had no idea what Irene involved herself in. I held his gaze. Then maybe you should worry about what she left behind. For the first time that day, he looked uncertain. He went back to Victor's truck without another word. They drove away in a spray of gravel. 20 minutes later, the power lines to the cabin were cut, and then everything changed. We ran a generator off the barn, but the dark felt heavier after that, like the mountain itself was listening. Late that night, while checking the edge of the property with flashlights, Eli and I followed a line of disturbed brush behind the old root cellar. Hidden beneath scrap boards, we found the weatherproof storage tube Irene had buried under the stone wall. Inside was a trail camera and 3 memory cards. My hands almost failed me. We hurried inside and loaded the first card. Deer. Rain. A fox. Empty trail. Second card. More of the same. Third card. The timestamp showed the night Irene died. At 11:43 p.m., Victor Dane appeared in frame near the ravine marker, arguing with someone off camera. At 11:44, Grant stepped in. My whole body went ice cold. There he was in a dark jacket, face turned toward the camera just enough to remove all doubt. He looked older than I remembered, and meaner than I had ever let myself admit. The footage had no sound, but it didn't need it. Irene came into frame holding a flashlight and what looked like a folder. She pointed toward the road as if ordering them off her land. Victor moved toward her. Grant grabbed her arm. She fought back. The folder fell. Papers scattered. In the struggle, Irene stumbled backward near the ravine edge. For a horrifying second, she vanished from the camera view. Victor looked down. Grant did too. Neither moved to help. They stood there, my husband and his partner, looking into darkness where an old woman had just fallen. Then Grant yanked Victor's sleeve, and the two of them turned and ran. I couldn't breathe. Billy paused the footage and swore under his breath. That's manslaughter at least. No, I whispered. It's worse. Because leaving a stranger might be cowardice. Leaving a woman who had just challenged the fraud, a woman who was family to me, a woman Grant knew had tried to warn me that was something uglier. That was choice. I started shaking so hard Eli had to take the laptop from me before I dropped it. My aunt had not simply suffered a tragic fall. She had been confronted, frightened, grabbed, and abandoned. And Grant had come home afterward, climbed into bed beside me in our half-dead marriage, and still kissed my forehead like his hands were clean. What I saw next shocked me in a different way. Tucked inside the camera tube was one more envelope. Inside was a single sheet in Irene's handwriting. If they come at night, it means they are afraid of daylight. I broke then not from weakness, but from the sheer force of all the truths arriving at once. I cried so hard my chest cramped. I cried for Irene at the bottom of that ravine. For every intercepted letter, for the baby I lost while married to a man with no soul big enough for grief, for the woman I had been when I kept trying to earn tenderness from cruelty. When the tears stopped, something new remained. Not peace, not yet. Purpose. We take this outside the county, I said. Eli nodded. State investigators, environmental office too. And the sheriff? He gets told last. By dawn, Nell had called a reporter she trusted in the next county. Haskell had reached a state environmental investigator, and Eli had uploaded copies of the trail footage to 3 separate places in case anyone tried to destroy the originals. We were moving before Victor and Grant knew we had the camera. We had one chance to outrun their influence. They figured it out by afternoon. I was in the barn sorting Irene's files when Grant burst through the side door like a man who had stopped pretending to be civilized. He must have used the old gate